I think all humans of all persuasions, cultures, and backgrounds, when you drill right into it, will offer this idea that they want their kids to have a decent chance at a long, healthy, happy life. Where they differ is about what they think those kids are going to need to have a long, healthy, happy life. Those are the political differences, the policy differences, and so many of the other things. But all cultures, I think that's a pretty common through line. And I get to wear many hats. So I work at Bemidji State University. I'm a language and culture guy, but I also have a PhD in history. And through my research, I've been bumping into, not only in my own personal life, but with a lot of the stories I've been navigating and researching, a lot of Native people who have lived a remarkably long life. Yeah, Archie Mosé was a spiritual leader from the St. Croix Reservation in Wisconsin. He was actually enrolled at Mille Lacs, but lived over at St. Croix. And he was an important spiritual mentor to me. Born in 1901, he passed away in 1996. His father had lived to the age of 102 and was born in 1869, died in 1971. And this guy was like a blast from the past. His kids were born in wigwams. He spoke only Ojibwe. He met his first white man at the age of 12, which was an American experience. And he saw his first black man at the age of 30, same time he saw a car. When I met him, he was in a little modern house watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing really loud. Some big changes. He was good friends with a man from another tribe named Jim Funmaker. Perfect name for him. He was a Ho-Chunk guy. And he was still driving at age 102. And he'd get pulled over by the cops, and he'd tell the cops, "Boy, look at my license. You see how old I am? I have to speed. I might die before I get there." And the cop would laugh and let him go. And there were so many others. Famous Ojibwe chief Buffalo, Roger Jourdain, who was tribal chair at Red Lake for 32 years in a row. Just remarkable stories. But there were other folks too. Noden Wind, who was, among other things, Grand Marshal for the 4th of July parade in Bemidji, Minnesota in 1976 on the 200th anniversary of Minnesota, and he'd lived through more than half of America's first 200 years. It's pretty wild. And then these guys, Gagige Gijik from Warroad, Minnesota, who had lived well over 100 years. He would be the record holder if his birth date had been documented. And John Smith, also famous from Leech Lake, who had lived in 3 different centuries. Born in the 1700s, passed away in 1922. There before any white settlement, and still there when the soldiers are coming back from World War I and stuff like that. What amazing changes they must have seen. I think we'd all like to crack the code on what do they do. By the way, the official record holder for human longevity belongs to this woman from France, who passed away at 122 years. Thinking about what are the through lines, and I'm going to zoom out first and then we'll zoom in and talk about Indigenous Peoples Day. I read some of these books. These are famous books by non-Indigenous authors. Outlive, Dr. Atia, and he's saying eat right, exercise, keep lifting weights even when you're an elder, get enough sleep, that kind of stuff. But there's another thing that he talked about, and you can see it in Malcolm Gladwell's, I just read Outliers, amazing book. Stories about people who've achieved incredible things, and what he really says is that each of them, from the Beatles to Bill Gates, are really not such remarkable outliers, so much as they seized opportunity and in the most common ways. 10,000 hours to master something. And so it's both the opportunity and the seizing of it. And then the Good Life famous, this is the big longitudinal study that Harvard did on happiness. and they would take health conditions as well as interview people across multiple generations over a long, long period of time. If you ask somebody about their life over the past 50 years or 100 years, they're going to have a perspective, but it's really different when you check in each one of their years up to 100 years and find out what they're thinking at the moment. All of these guys and all of these elders that I'd worked with and studied did have a common through line, which is that humans are complex. We would love for it to be simple. Just do a carnivore diet and you're all set, right? Just do this exercise regimen and your problems are all behind you. But we need all kinds of things. Yes, eat right and exercise does matter. But relational health matters way more than we've ever imagined. The quality of relationships pays huge dividends to longevity and to happiness. That might not sound like rocket science. It's kind of common sense. But achieving relationship health, and that doesn't just mean marital or romantic relationship, healthy relationships with kids, extended family, community, your neighbors, that you cannot put a big enough emphasis on. And I think one of the things that is challenging this for all of us, while we, like human longevity was less in previous times than it is today, because of innovations in modern medicine and all kinds of things. At the same time, it is plateaued, and sometimes, not just during COVID, we've seen drops in human longevity. We're bumping up against the boundaries of what medicine can deliver. I want you to think about the importance of that. Keep that in the back of your mind and put it in the context of how humans have treated each other throughout time and how we're doing at that today. Because there's plenty we can do and do differently. You might have heard about Abraham Maslow. He did Maslow's hierarchy of needs, famously published. You know, he has this stuff. You've got your physical needs, food, clothing, shelter, and if you kind of move up the pyramid at the very top, you know, doing a pirouette, self-actualization and, you know, all of that. That's what his study says, and it's been widely adopted and incorporated in a lot of not just scientific, but modern social understandings about what does it look like to thrive. What is less commonly known is that Maslow, who is a psychologist, was also kind of part anthropologist. His initial study was among the Blackfeet. And in his study, this pyramid that he has shared with the world is not what he found. He actually found that the healthy humans, the self-actualization part, was really at the bottom and base of the pyramid. And that when you look at it, there's actually a community-based actualization, which is one of the biggest drivers for health. And then as you climb up, maintaining cultural perpetuity, keeping that flywheel humming, is the key to healthy humans. I guess it's another way to say relational health drives and contributes to all the other kinds of health. So when you compare those, it's pretty clear that Maslow kind of distorted what he found playing anthropologist and put it through a very Western lens with a heavy emphasis on individualism and individual accomplishment and really weeding out the community and relational dimensions of healthy humanity. It was probably a terrible disservice to us all, but it's good to know that it was there. Relational health contributes to longevity. Indigenous folks of every type have maintained a myriad of diverse ways to deliver community and relational health. Ceremony, cultural practice, community, It feeds all these other things like sense of purpose. The receiving is in the giving. Servant leadership, other things that people talk about and frame in different ways. And language, which is connection and community. If you go back to caveman days, we survived cave bears and saber-toothed tigers, not because we outcompeted the person in the next cave, not because we accumulated more resources than them. We survived those things because the person in the next cave loved us, and they would intervene if we were in trouble. As human beings, we are hardwired to need connection, belonging, and love. And the Western world heavily emphasizes individualism, materialism, and competition. I'm not saying a healthy competition can't serve positive purposes or things like that, but it's a very different way of looking at the world, and it sometimes works at cross purposes or injures some of the most critical things we need as humans to have a long, healthy, happy life. You could also think about it like this. What is colonization? And colonization has been many things, but among them, there is a pervasive pattern of one group of people coming, trying to take one language, culture, and religion and use it to supplant all the others. It has been about erasure. And it's used a lot of violence to orchestrate the erasure. When you solve your problems with violence, though, it makes a bunch of other problems. Now, why would we think that all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems could be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? And they cannot. They cannot. And that's for all of us. I'm not just talking about, who's been at the victim end of historical processes. I do think when there's an oppression, yes, it's worse being the victim. But it's dehumanizing to everyone. To everyone. America's won most of its wars. And our proud, brave American soldiers have paid a heavy price. Not just in loss of life, but in mental health and all kinds of other things. Even when you win, quote unquote win, sometimes you lose. And so we need to find a different way. By the way, there are other things to think about with this. For those who are steeped in the culture of colonization, which is the culture of erasure, it also explains our politics today. One of the greatest fears will be fear of one's own erasure. White folk afraid of white erasure, and trying to put pressure to keep those stories as the story, which doesn't just injure those who are dealing with marginalization, but injures them too. We all need healing. And we're humans, we should practice humanity. We all need healing, and we all deserve healing. White men dominate the ranks of school shooters, serial killers, and have one of the most plateaued and sometimes declining longevity data sets. We all need the healing. And the healing doesn't come from crushing the enemy, and keeping them out of here, which is really like throwing water over a chicken wire fence. It comes from successfully practicing humanity. And in spite of 500 pretty rough years, Native people are not just still here, but have still held on to more than vestigial remnants of some different ways to practice humanity. I've come to learn that so many of the things that we treasure, longevity, happiness, and so forth, they're not a destination. They're just a practice. You get married, you put a ring on a finger, and we say happily ever after, but that does not mean happily ever after. And I'm not just talking about divorce data. It's just a promise to practice at happily ever after. And some days, let's be honest, the practice goes better than others. Some months or years, it goes better than others. But if you keep practicing, you do become happier. Health, you can't get all your workouts in one day in the gym. It's practice. And let's be honest, some days better than others. But if you keep practicing, you do become healthier. And it's like that with all the other forms of healing, health, and happiness too. It's practice. I get to officiate at some of our most treasured ceremonies in Ojibwe country. It's been the great honor of my life. And as much as anything, our ceremonial space is a community of practice, where we practice feasting, and we practice offering, and we practice praying for others, not just ourselves, where we practice generosity and kindness and the investment of our time in someone else's well-being. We practice what Maslow first saw, and it pays tremendous dividends. I love Abigail Echo Hawk's quote where she said, "We are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved. I'm institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient." That is backed up by everything I've seen and studied. Even our modern data sets, where we see plenty of problems. When you go back to 1969, 50% of the native population is below the poverty line. When you flash forward to today, it's 23%. Well, tells you two things. One is 23% of a population below the poverty line is gross and unacceptable, and that's an indictment on America and its oppressions, not Native people and their lack of a work ethic. It also means we shaved 30-some points off of Indigenous poverty. Has to be the fastest growth rate out of poverty for any group in the country. So instead of looking at Indigenous people with paternalism and pity, we should be asking, how did they do that? How can we scale that up? How can we apply those lessons to everyone else? How can I ally myself to those efforts so we can do more and better? Instead of just, oh, those poor people. By the way, if you ever want to get things done in mixed company, paternalism and pity will not help you. I don't know how many of you have been in a romantic relationship or a marriage and approached your partner with paternalism and pity and had it go well. But if you approach them with partnership, something totally different starts to happen. Here too, there's a lot to learn. I was looking at, in spite of the things I've studied and what I've been learning about longevity, when you look at the data sets, this is the national aggregated stuff right off of the US Census, and the native longevity data is the lowest of all disaggregated racial groups in the country. But that doesn't even tell you everything you need to know. We are internally diverse. 70% of tribal members are living off reservation, and there are huge differences between reservations and regions, and none of that tells you everything you need to know. They do not disaggregate by reservation, urban, rural, within the Native American longevity data, so it's a data, we got a lot of work to do there. However, we do have some, and it's more than anecdotal, like there have been studies on longevity in certain tribal places. And some of them are much worse than that average. There are 10 million tribal members by the US Census, but that is self-identified. You can't just click a button and boil it down to enrolled tribal members. But I bet you would see some differences. Native people have the highest rate of marriage to people from other groups. We are especially multiracial, especially within the self-identified population. Some of the studies we've looked at, I almost hesitate to share something on Pine Ridge or something like that because they get picked on a lot. But it's not pretty. One of the studies was showing a life expectancy of 48 for men and 52 for women at Pine Ridge. Don't go thinking those poor people. It's complex. So why, when we found so many examples of Native people living a long time and so many healthy examples of Native people having cultures that provided an excellent platform for practicing relational health as well as eat right and exercise, how come we're at this? And I think some of the answers have to do with what happened after Christopher Columbus arrived. Colonization caused a lot of injury. And having it go on for so long. And I'm not going to do much on history lessons. There's a lot to study there. Someone showing up saying, I claim ownership of this land and I claim ownership of all these people. Must have been pretty disruptive when you thrived on community relational health. And all the other chapters throughout time. In a place like the United States, there were tribal groups who endured a Spanish colonization, a French colonization, a British colonization, a Russian colonization, a Dutch colonization, and then a whole new American colonization. It went on for a real long time. In many ways, you could make a pretty good case it's not over yet. Our modern educational system is still very colonial. Of all the stories in the historical tapestry that makes up America, we really sell a pretty narrow range of them. And it's a tremendous disservice to everyone. It is a disservice to those who are from marginalized communities not to have their own stories at the center of the narrative. It feels like the systems are the continuation of an age-old assault on our very ways of being, our identity. White students tend to do better in the colonial educational system. And if you're a white student and you go to school in America, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a white educator at some point. You might even have only white educators at every single point of the journey. People from marginalized groups are not guaranteed that. When we talk about things like white privilege, we're not talking about economic advantage, but the advantage of having your stories centered in the curriculum. The privilege of being taught by somebody from your own racial group. And so no wonder white students are doing better when their identity, stories, and so forth are affirmed at every level of the journey. But we're not trying to build a white empowerment program. We're trying to do education and opportunity for all. It's also a tremendous disservice to the white students to be prepared for a world that will never exist. Even if you're from North Dakota, one of the whiter parts of the United States, to prepare the white students for a world that will never exist. There will be a diverse world, and we should prepare them for their neighbors, work environments, and everything else. I really love this Gabor Mate quote. He said, "The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection." Even somebody dealing with alcohol addiction can heal to the point where they can walk into a bar and order a burger without falling off the wagon. If they are connected to anything, their higher power, their marriage, their family, their cultural practice, or even the person bringing them the burger. To me, language and culture is connection. It's about healing, not just another pretty bird singing in the forest.